Hey everybody, welcome. This is Mr. General again, coming to you from Clovis Community College here. We're going to take a look at the Week 3 lecture slides here. This goes along with Chapter 3 of the same textbook, Resonances. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. Take a look at the Canvas page for this week. So first, we are on the Week 3 module. We have just one assignment due this week. It is the Writing Assignment 3, and it will be due this Sunday, January 29th. If you look at the Week 3 overview, always a good place to look for all the information for the week. We see our overview, the objectives, and the activities. So for this week, review Chapter 3 lecture slides and all the listening example videos. This week is kind of unique in the fact that the reading and the lecture slides are the same information. I literally copied all the information from the textbook and put it into slide format. So if you don't want to go through and read the whole textbook this week, that is okay. It might be, for some of you, your preferred way of reading, though, is from the textbook. So that is always available if you want to just read it straight from the text. You can also just look at the lecture slides though this week. And again, I do that because the videos there are going to be current. All the YouTube links will work. So I recommend to use the lecture slides along with this video that you're watching right now. So open that up and you can follow along with me. We're also going to pause at certain moments where you can actually stop and you can pause my video and listen to the listening examples that are on the lecture slides as well. And this week, we have just one written assignment due. It is the Week 3 writing assignment due this Sunday, like I already said. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's look at the homework questions first. So writing assignment 3 this week. You'll notice that this week the questions are a little bit more based on the ideas from the text. There's a little bit less room for personal opinion because we are starting to look at music as its function in storytelling. So we're going to look at some really good examples, things that maybe you already are aware of, but also some composers that might be new for you, some new pieces of music as well. So let's go ahead and read these. Please write 4 to 5 sentences for each question. Be sure to reference or cite ideas from the Chapter 3 lecture slides. Question number 1. Listen to one of the themes from Star Wars on lecture slide 8 and 9. You can choose either Leia's theme, the Force theme, or Yoda's theme. What musical elements like rhythm, pitch, volume, articulation, and timbre do you hear? How do these musical elements connect to the character the music is supposed to represent? So this is your chance to combine some information from Chapter 2, stuff that we already know from this class about the musical elements that are mentioned here, but using them to listen more thoroughly to one of these themes that were made famous in the Star Wars movies. Question number 2. Describe the terms Leitmotif and Gesamtkunstwerk. This is found on slides 11, 13, 15, and 16. These terms come from Wagner's thoughts on music. After doing the chapter reading and watching the video on slide 16, what do you think the leitmotifs are such a powerful tool for storytelling? We'll talk about this idea of the leitmotif later on today, and also this bigger word of Gesamtkunstwerk. They're big German words, but don't be afraid. They're pretty easy to understand. Continuing on, question number 3. What was Gustav Holst's inspiration and intention in writing his set of pieces, The Planets? What were his fears about the audience perception of the piece, and what did he do to address this? So kind of a multi-part question here about The Planets by Gustav Holst. Continuing on, question 4. What artistic choices did Igor Stravinsky and his team make to create the ballet The Rite of Spring? What made this work different than other ballets of the era? Number 5. What is a rondo form and why is it effective? This is a key term that you should know for this class is rondo form. Number 6. Define diegetic and non-diegetic music. Provide an example of both diegetic and non-diegetic music from a movie or television show of your choice. It should be a different example from those that are already provided by the textbook. We'll talk about these two terms later on in the lecture. Number 7, what are syncopated rhythms? How do these types of rhythms relate to the style known as ragtime music? Number 8, slide 52 states, ragtime piano compositions were never intended to be performed exactly as written. Listen to a few examples from the text or slides of ragtime music. What are the difference in the role of the composer versus the performer in these jazz styles compared to the fixed compositions of classical music? Almost done. Number 9. What is a second line band and how does it relate to Dixieland music? What characteristics define these styles of music? Number 10. Who were King Oliver and Louis Armstrong? How does the recording of King Oliver's piece, Dipper Mouth Blues, performed by Louis Armstrong, demonstrate qualities of both the Dixieland and blues styles? What is a blue note? And the last question, how does composer John Williams take inspiration from each of the following composers to create some of the music featured in his musical score for Star Wars? Write 3 to 4 sentences for each one. This is kind of the overarching question of the class, is how did John Williams, a composer who we all know, we know his movies, we know the things that he's worked on, how was he inspired musically from these other people? I would like you to write about Richard Wagner and his idea about leitmotif and how this influences John Williams, Igor Stravinsky and how this influenced some of John Williams' non-diegetic music, and last, King Oliver and Louis Armstrong and how they might have influenced John Williams' diegetic music that is featured in Star Wars. Now again, when you read all these questions, there might be some terms that might be totally new. Most people don't know about these terms non-diegetic and diegetic music at first. That's why it's so important to read the chapter and to build this knowledge for ourselves. Okay, without further ado, let's jump straight into the lecture here. Like I said, I would follow along with this lecture as you go. You can also have your homework assignment, maybe open in a different tab or on a separate piece of paper, write some good notes, because by going through this slide, we should be able to answer all the questions that were present within the homework questions there. So this week is chapter 3. It's called Music and Characterization. When we think about this idea that music can stand for something other than just being a pretty song that we hear on the radio. Music can stand for a character. It can stand for a storyline. It can stand for some major themes or some ideas of a story. These are qualities that we don't always think about, but music is a very, very powerful tool for this kind of storytelling. Now we use the word characterization, so I thought it would be good to include, of course, some very famous pictures. We see here Darth Vader. You can probably already imagine what the music would sound like for Darth Vader. Even if you don't know anything about him, you can tell by his very mysterious look, the helmet, the dark clothing, the sword that he has, the lightsaber. You can already get an idea of what his music would sound like, even if you never saw Star Wars. Here, too, we see a traditional costume that we will talk about later when we talk about The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, and these were some of the costumes that they created. So imagine what music is going to go along with these characters in that storyline as well. So the introduction. Music may have originally developed for the purpose of communication, and has become a powerful tool in the telling of stories. Over the next 4 chapters, we will explore ways in which music has been used to convey, enhance, or transform stories in a variety of cultural contexts. Most storytellers use music with great care. They do so because it is powerful. Music can help to set the mood in a video game, or allow a character on stage to express emotion by singing, or add interest and gravity to a recitation of an epic poem. It can encourage an audience member to get more involved in a performance, either emotionally or by joining in with the music making. It can help a listener to remember the words of a story. It can say things that go beyond words and images. Music is used to tell stories in many different ways. Sometimes it accompanies images, such as in a film. Sometimes it is combined with stage action, as in ballets and musicals. Sometimes it is paired with a text, which might be sung to provided to the listener to read. Of course, we can choose to hear a story in any piece of music. And we will encounter examples later in the book that seem as if they must be communicating something, even if we can't say exactly what it is. In the next 4 chapters, however, we will examine pieces of music that are used to tell clearly defined stories, and we will focus on understanding how music enriches and impacts those stories. So again, bringing it all together, they start off by saying that music is a form of communication originally. So it makes sense that we could maybe use music to help bring these stories to life. Now, the movie Star Wars, I hope that most of you have seen it. It is a classic, but even if you haven't, you're going to be able to relate to a lot of the things that we hear in the music because it really is so universal. We will start with an example that is familiar to most listeners, the music created for the Star Wars films. We will examine this music on its own terms, but through it we will also encounter 5 other works and styles that strongly impacted the creation of this score. So not only are we looking at Star Wars, we're looking at some of the music that inspired the music in Star Wars. Let's continue. No art exists in a vacuum. New works are built upon old, and creators rely upon cultural memory to communicate meaning. Even the Star Wars films were not conjured out of a vacuum. Director George Lucas based his creation on Akira Kurosawa's 1958 samurai film, The Hidden Fortress. So this is just to say that all art, but especially music, we can talk about films too, they build off of pre-existing art forms. So the things that worked 100 years ago musically can still have a similar impact on us today. And John Williams does this to great effect by basing some of his music off of other very famous pieces of music that already existed. You probably already have a wealth of associations with the Star Wars soundtrack, both personal and general, as a result of having watched the films. On the personal level, you might find that this music evokes nostalgic memories of watching Star Wars with your family as a child, or it might make you uncomfortable if you found the films particularly scary or sad. Such responses are valid and worth exploring. Here, however, we will focus on objective characteristics of the music that help us to explain how it enhances the story. So this is just to say, even if you just love the Star Wars music, or if you don't like the Star Wars music for some reason, don't let that be the thing that influences how you're hearing this today. Instead, try to think about, what is the story of Star Wars? Who are the main characters? What are the main themes that we're trying to explore? And how does the music directly relate to these ideas? So first, let's start off with some backstory. The soundtrack to the Star Wars films was composed by one of the most prolific and influential of all cinema composers, John Williams, who was born in 1932. Williams' career took off in 1974 when director Steven Spielberg recruited him to score his first feature production called The Sugarland Express. The two went on to produce a string of hit films with memorable soundtracks, including Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, the Indiana Jones films, and the first 2 Jurassic Park films. This kind of collaboration has long played a role in the production of great music. We will see similar partnerships at work in opera and ballet. It was Spielberg who recommended Williams to George Lucas, the director of the Star Wars films. His score for the original Star Wars trilogy, A New Hope in 1977, The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, and The Return of the Jedi in 1983 are among the best-known musical works created for the big screen. And here you can see John Williams himself, the composer, in 2011. He is still alive. He is making a little bit less music than he used to, but he was conducting late into his life, which is pretty amazing to see. So, John Williams studied at UCLA and the Juilliard School of Music. And he certainly knew his music history and concert repertoire. So he knows the history of the composers that we're talking about a little bit. He also had decades of experience as a session musician in Los Angeles, recording soundtracks for television and film. He came to the task of writing film scores, therefore, with a deep understanding of how music can shape the viewer's experience of a drama. The Star Wars soundtrack. At the heart of Williams' soundtrack is a series of themes, about 11 per film. Each represents an individual character, setting, or idea. The viewer doesn't need a guide to these themes. Instead, one quickly connects music with on-screen action as themes return throughout the films. Here, we will examine themes associated with Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Yoda, and the Force. Williams carefully crafted each of these themes to represent the character or idea, and they are used both to amplify the on-screen action and to enrich the storytelling. So here we see John Williams conducting, probably recording one of these movie scores that we're talking about. Here you can see there is a video link, so I would like you to listen to the main theme from Star Wars. You probably know it already, but try to listen to it and just imagine all the things that it conjures up in your memory. This is, again, the powerful effect that music has on us. Okay, continuing. We're going to look at some of the main themes, musical themes of Star Wars. We will begin with Luke Skywalker's theme, officially titled the main theme, which is first overheard over the opening title. This is clearly the music of a hero. The opening fanfare suggests royalty, while the duple meter in moderate tempo tells us that this is a march. This, in combination with brass-heavy instrumentation, suggests a military character, a good representation of the Rebel Alliance. The melody soars into the upper range, confirming Skywalker's confidence and authority with a series of leaps to the high tonic scale degree. The tonic scale degree is the first and most important note of the scale on which the melody is built. Trumpets, with their bright timbre, are more prominent than the other brass instruments. And of course, Skywalker's music is in the major mode, meaning it sounds happy to us. Happy or confident, I should say, for major mode. In addition, this theme has more emotional depth than Darth Vader's. It is in a three-part form, which might be described as A, B, A prime. So note that whenever we see this little apostrophe after a section in a form, this is an A, B, A form. The A prime tells us that this has a slight variation compared to the A that we heard in the original, but they do have a lot of things in common. So we call this A prime. While the A section has the characteristics described above, the B section features the string section, thereby introducing a warmer timbre and indicating that our hero has a human side as well. Finally, the fact that we hear Skywalker's theme over the opening title tells us from the start who is going to emerge from this conflict victorious. So again, the fact that we're using Star Wars as an example and knowing about Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker a little bit, the fact that we hear his song first, Luke Skywalker, and that it is triumphant, it is happy, it tells us a lot already about the story. Who should we be rooting for, right? Who's the good guy? Who's going to come out of this, hopefully as the hero? Now would be a good time to pause my video and instead to click on the lecture slide. We're here on slide 6. Listen to Luke's theme, which is also the main theme of Star Wars, right here, and try to listen to it with these time indicators now. You're going to hear the intro, the A section, the B section, and then the A prime section before the listening guide kind of ends out here, okay? So pause this video, listen to this one instead, please, and then come back. Okay, moving right along here. So the next theme that we're going to look at is the Imperial March, which of course belongs to the infamous Darth Vader character. The theme that represents the villain, Darth Vader, has many of the same characteristics. It, too, is a march. The theme is entitled the Imperial March, and it features similar instrumentation. However, this theme is in the minor mode, which lets us know that this is the bad guy. The fact that the melody is played in a low range makes the music ominous, while the chromatic pitches and unusual harmonies make it mysterious. Darth Vader's theme is forceful and threatening, perhaps even unstoppable, but it is not heroic. Okay? So again, this is all about contrast. This piece has a lower range. We hear lower notes from the orchestra. We're in the minor mode. We hear chromatic pitches and mysterious, unusual harmonies. Again, you can pause this video, watch this live performance of the Imperial March, and listen for these things here. So in the intro, the strings and percussion lay down a pattern of dotted rhythms suggesting a slow, militaristic march. Dotted rhythms have to do with syncopation. We'll get there later today, actually. At A, the A section, the trombones and trumpets play a low, ominous melody, the very famous melody. B, this section of the melody begins with a leap to the high range, followed by a twisted chromatic descent. That tells you a lot about the character already, right? And last, the B prime section. The repetition of B concludes differently. So this B section is going to come back, but have a slightly different ending to it. That makes me already think about what I know about the movie, not to spoil anything for anybody. I also think it's worth noting here that this is a march. The march music that we're hearing in the Star Wars universe is very similar to the march music that we hear in our own, non-fictional universe, right? So just to say that a march is the same as it is on our planet, as it is in these distant galaxies, is kind of a unique thing to think about. The fact that we have these marches in both settings. So again, pause this video, listen to John Williams conducting the Imperial March on this video right here with this listening guide. See if you can listen for these instruments and these musical ideas that come forth. Okay, so these next ones is where you have some choice for your homework. So you get to choose either these two videos or the one on the next slide. Just talk about one of them and think about what kind of music are you hearing? What elements of music are you hearing related to these pieces? So the first is Leia's theme. The other themes are similarly suited to their subjects. Leia's theme opens with a winding chromatic melody in the flute and oboe before unfolding into an expressive melody for French horn with muted strings in the background. The music suggests seduction and romance, while largely ignoring her role as an action hero. Although there is a historical connection between the horn and heroes of the opera stage. So what I like about this is that it tells us a little bit about the character, but also, if you know the movie, Princess Leia isn't just a princess, she also is a great military mind too. So she has this hero side of her as well. Another interesting thing is that the instruments that we use are not just random. The fact that we use the flute and the oboe, to me, suggests something kind of expressive and delicate, which gives us the idea of a princess. However, like they say, the instrument known as the French horn does have this very heroic presence to it, and it has been used in operas throughout history to represent hero characters. So the instruments are not just random. The next one is perhaps the slowest theme, is called the Force theme, is used to represent the Force. But now, the tempo signifies inevitability and power. The theme itself is in the minor mode, not because it is tragic, but because it is serious. It starts with a lone French horn, supported by tremolo in the strings, but grows dramatically in volume to embrace the whole orchestra. So again, we hear a solo instrument as the main melody, but then we hear some light tremolo in the strings. Tremolo is a very, very fast but very gentle pattern of moving back and forth on the same note over and over. It gives us a very kind of shimmery and mysterious effect. So again, you can choose either of these two videos to do for your homework assignment, but I'm going to move on here. The other one that you can choose from is right here, Yoda's theme. Let's read about this. Yoda's theme is heard in the cellos and oboes with a peaceful accompaniment of strings, bassoons, and harp. The instrumentation resonates with his life in the woods, while the simplicity of the melody communicates his character. Both themes are heard at the same moderate tempo, an indication of romance in one case and peace in the other. So again, this is one that you could talk about too. And if you know anything about Yoda, he is a mysterious character. He's in some ways a very lovable character in these movies. So it's interesting to hear what he might sound like through music. The musical themes of Star Wars, wrapping it up here. This has been a fairly technical description of each theme's attributes, but the character of the music is easy to perceive without specialized knowledge. It is worth a reminder, however, that our understanding of what music expresses is determined by our own cultural contexts. This music builds on centuries of stylistic development and depends on each listener's lifetime of experience. We understand what it is trying to communicate because we dwell in the same musical world as the composer. So that's just to say that we've heard a lot of the same things that John Williams has heard, even if we haven't been aware of it. We've heard the same breadth of musical style, and therefore the things that are true about his music really resonate with us because they come from this history. Let's continue. Sound, however, seldom has objective meaning. We recognize the sounds of a military march because we have heard one somewhere else. We know that swelling strings signify romance because we have seen 100 other movies, which in turn build upon older theatrical traditions. A listener from a culture that had no military bands and which, say, organ music was understood to signal romance, would not make these connections. So this is to say that, remember that we're always tied to our history and the music that has already been out there before us. We have certain associations with what we've already heard. We also have no association with things that maybe are more foreign to us. So it's good to recognize where our natural listening tendencies are going to go. Now we're going to jump to a totally different subject matter here with a different composer, but knowing that this was music that really inspired the work of composer John Williams in making Star Wars. Okay, so we'll talk about Richard Wagner, who lived from 1813 to 1883. He is a Romantic era composer, and we'll learn about him a little bit. We are now going to explore that cultural context. John Williams was well educated in the Western concert and theatrical traditions. He served in the U.S. Air Force. This is John Williams again. He served in the U.S. Air Force from 1952 to 1955, during which time he played piano and brass arrangement music and conducted. His piano degree from the Juilliard School in New York City came with a thorough grounding in music history, and his decades recording film and television scores as a session musician in Los Angeles allowed him to become deeply familiar with the conventions of the screen. So this is to say, he knows about the history of classical music. He also knows about what works on film and television when it comes to creating the music too. Our examples, however, will come not from television or movies, but from older traditions of theatrical music. When we say theatrical music, we really mean things that were meant for the live stage. This could be a ballet, an opera, any kind of live musical performance that tells a story. We will begin with an example from the opera repertoire. In the European tradition, opera is a staged work of music theater, complete with costumes, sets, and dramatic plot twists. Most operas employ an orchestra to accompany the stage performers, who often sing throughout. While Richard Wagner's style and melodies certainly influenced Williams's work, the Imperial March, for example, is clearly derived from a theme Wagner wrote to represent a magical helmet known as Tarnhelm. We will focus here on Williams' use of a technique that Wagner perfected, the technique of assigning a unique theme to each character, object, place, and idea in a drama. Wagner called such a theme a leitmotif. So this theme, this idea of a leitmotif, is huge in Wagner, but we can also hear it across different kinds of music. You can even hear this in Star Wars, and we'll get at that a little bit later. But the idea that a leitmotif is a small melody that can represent a character, object, place, or even an idea in a drama. Now let's listen to this. This is one of Richard Wagner's selections of music here that has a close resemblance to the Imperial March. Let's listen to it. So, not exactly the same, of course, that would be copyright infringement, but we can see that there are some similarities. So, before we listen more to Wagner, let's talk about his life and his career a little bit. Before examining Wagner's music, some biographical context is called for. It is possible that Richard Wagner has had a greater impact on the development of Western art music than any other composer. For such a towering figure, however, he got off to a very slow start. He did not exhibit any particular talent as a child and never became an accomplished performer. In his 20s, he dedicated himself to the composition of operas, although it was many years before he made a success of the endeavor. In 1839, he actually had to crawl through the gutters of Riga to escape his creditors after having his passport confiscated by the municipal authorities. Then, in 1849, he became involved in an attempt to overthrow the Dresden government. He not only helped to plan what is now known as the May Uprising, but actually participated throwing grenades in the street. After the uprising failed, Wagner fled to Switzerland, where he remains in exile for most of a decade. In Switzerland, Wagner shifted his attention from practice to theory. He quit writing music for several years and instead wrote about music. In one 1849 essay, The Artwork of the Future, Wagner theorized a Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, that would bring together all art forms: music, dance, gesture, poetry, image, into a single, ideal medium of artistic expression. Naturally, he imagined himself as the artist who was most capable of achieving this fusion. To prove the power of his ideas, he set to work on a monumental cycle of music dramas that would take him decades to complete. In a highly unusual move, Wagner not only wrote the music for these operas, but also developed the narrative, wrote the libretto, the sung text, and even designed the theater in which the operas were eventually premiered. This project took him decades to complete, and the entire cycle was not premiered until 1876. By this time, Wagner had returned to Germany under the patronage of the King of Bavaria, who admired his work and offered him permanent financial support. The king also financed the construction of a grand opera house, the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, to Wagner's specifications. It was there that the complete cycle was finally staged. So we're talking about this very large piece of work that Wagner wrote. We don't know what it's called yet, but it is an example of a Gesamtkunstwerk. This idea that he had that if we combine all the different forms of artistic expression, we can make a very immersive and also very stimulating piece of art that is going to combine drama, theater, dance, music, the imagery. He even thought about where is this going to be formed. He designed the concert hall for his pieces too. Okay, so the piece from Richard Wagner that we're talking about is known as The Ring of the Nibelungs. In German, it is Der Ring der Nibelungen, or it is more commonly known as the Ring Cycle. The Ring Cycle consists of 4 massive operas and takes about 15 hours to perform. The story derives from Norse mythology, which Wagner understood to describe the ascent of his own German race. The operas enact a prolonged struggle between the gods and the humans. The gods are ruled by Wotan, the German version of the more familiar named Odin, who seeks to consolidate their power, but he is finally defeated by the human Siegfried. The story begins with the forging of a powerful ring out of gold extracted from the Rhine River, and ends with the return of the ring to the river, the burning of Valhalla, and the flooding of the Rhine. These catastrophes mark a new age of human rule, the Norse myth of Ragnarok. Like John Williams and George Lucas, Wagner relied on centuries of cultural history in crafting his masterpiece. The story outlined above is not original. His approach to setting that story to music was also not original, although he took pre-existing techniques to new heights. To begin with, Wagner expanded the size of his orchestra, including new instruments into the brass section. These instruments, which included the bass trumpet, contrabass trombone, and a euphonium-type device known as the Wagner tuba, allowed him to produce a more subtle variety of timbres for the creation of diverse sound worlds. His musical style, like that of other composers of the time, was highly varied and expressive, although many of Wagner's contemporaries felt that his music set the bar for intensity of emotional content. Finally, Wagner adapted and transformed a practice that had been long common in opera, the use of recurring melodic themes, known as leitmotifs, to help tell the story. So the big takeaways here is that Wagner, through all of these techniques in his deep thinking about the music, was able to create music that was much more subtle, had a diverse range of sounds, especially through the brass instruments that he created and had commissioned for his orchestras, and that all of this really allows him to express emotion through the music in a variety of different levels and intensities. And of course, the leitmotifs are a huge part of that. Let's get into that now. If a listener sits through Wagner's entire 15-hour drama, they will hear hundreds of leitmotifs, most of which are frequently repeated. Some span all four operas, while some are restricted to an act or even a single scene. Each is connected to an important element of the drama, and each is introduced along with that element. The first time Wotan picks up his spear, for example, we hear a forceful, march-like descending melody in the brass. This music then returns every time we see the spear or hear a reference to it. Wagner's leitmotifs are often melodically connected to each other, such that themes representing related ideas or characters sound similar to one another. The leitmotifs can also be transformed as the power of an idea or object shifts over the course of the story. Most importantly, however, the leitmotifs can be used to communicate information to an audience that is not included in the libretto or on-stage action. So to put this into context, remember that the leitmotif is a small musical idea that can represent a person, a place, or even an object, like we saw, for example, with the spear. Whenever that spear comes up, we're going to hear that same leitmotif which connects all of the story together. It also means that if you hear the spear leitmotif, even when the spear isn't on the stage, you'll recognize that they're making some kind of a connection to that object. That's probably the best example I can give. I also like this fact that some of the leitmotifs we only hear maybe once or twice within a single scene, but some of the leitmotifs we hear in all four of the operas. So it's really a recurring musical idea that tells you this is a character or an idea that is spanning all four of the big operas that we're talking about from Wagner. Now, this is a great video which I pulled from the textbook. It talks about the importance of leitmotif in Wagner's Ring Cycle, but it also gives us an interesting look into the expansion of the brass family of instruments. One part of this class that you should know is knowing all the different families of musical instruments. So this is a great time to learn about some of the brass instruments that we don't normally see in the orchestra, but that Wagner had specially made for his big musical idea of the Ring Cycle. So again, pause this video, take a break from hearing me talk, and watch this video, which talks more in depth about Wagner and his instruments and ideas connected to the leitmotif. So let's continue with leitmotif in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Um, the opera that we're talking about, part of it has to do with the Valkyrie. So we're going to take a look at the final scene, Act 3, Scene 3, of the second opera, which is called The Valkyrie. This scene contains two characters, Wotan and his favorite daughter, Brunhilde. At this point in the drama, Brunhilde, daughter of the god Wotan, has disobeyed her father's orders by interceding on behalf of the humans Sigmund and Sieglind. Despite their efforts, Sigmund is killed, and Brunhilde is left to face Wotan's fury. The punishment for disobeying the ruler of the gods is death, but Wotan takes pity on Brunhilde, whom he loves dearly, and instead declares his intention to strip her of her immortality and powers, and put her into a magical sleep on top of the mountain. He conjures Loge, the demigod of fire, to erect a ring of flames around Brunhilde, and declares that only a hero who does not fear his spear will be able to pass through the fire and wake his daughter. So these are some engravings that depict Wotan with Brunhilde right here to give it some scope for you all. This scene, which lasts less than 20 minutes, contains 21 separate leitmotifs. Indeed, the listener hears virtually no music that cannot be classified as a leitmotif. Most of the themes in this scene were introduced in the first opera and have been heard many times, although some do not return after this scene. 4 themes, however, are introduced in this scene and proceed to play an important role in the remaining operas. Although various musical scholars have counted and named Wagner's leitmotifs in different ways, we will use the descriptions supplied by Roger Donington in 1963. So again, these are maybe things that Wagner didn't exactly spell out that he had a name for all these. But when you listen to the operas and you hear the same melodic idea, the same musical material coming back and associated with these objects or these characters, there's definitely a correlation. So scholars of music have taken the time to give them names and to identify them throughout the different parts of the ring cycle. According to Donington, the scene in question contains the following leitmotifs. All of these right here. Love as fulfillment motif. The Wotan frustrated leitmotif. Powerful destiny. Unavoidable destiny is another leitmotif. Valkyries as animus. Valhalla. Wotan's spear. Relinquishment. Volsung as destiny. The love of Sigmund and Sieglind, downfall of the gods, the curse, Siegfried's heroism, sword as manhood, magic sleep, innocent sleep, ambivalent loge, Wotan's grief, renunciation, and loge as fire. There are 2 different versions of that last one. As you can see, these themes connect with a wide variety of dramatic elements. Some are straightforward representations of objects or places, while others embody abstract concepts. All enrich the drama and aid in telling the story. So you can relate this to Star Wars too. The fact that we talked about some themes that represent characters like Luke, Leia, Yoda, or Darth Vader, but there's also a theme for the Force, which is a bigger idea, a bigger concept of those movies. The same thing is happening in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Like Williams, Wagner did not randomly pair themes with objects and ideas. Each leitmotif expresses meaning and sound. We will examine a few of the themes used in this scene before seeing them in action. The music associated with Loge as fire, for example, is meant to capture the characteristics of flame. This passage features high-pitched instruments with bright timbres, such as the flute and the sharply articulated melody that leaps out. The music almost sparkles. Swells and ebbs in the music, like swells and flow, created using rising and falling dynamic levels and pitches. So not only are they saying that the pitches of the notes are going higher and higher, they're also talking about the volume going from soft to loud, getting louder, and then loud to soft, getting softer. That creates a big impression on us as a listener. So these ideas represent the unpredictable spread of fire across the ground. This kind of music has long been associated with winds and storms also. In contrast, both of the sleep motifs are slow and peaceful. So again, a new motif is sleep. And they feature the soothing sounds of strings and harps. The leitmotif Magic Sleep consists of gradual chromatic descent that comes as close as music can to representing the act of falling asleep. Innocent Sleep, another leitmotif, on the other hand, is easily recognized as a lullaby, with its rocking rhythms, lilting melody, and stable harmonies. I'm going to go ahead and play each of these leitmotifs. So here's the first one, Loge as Fire. Remember, we're thinking about this is meant to embody a fire through music. Let's listen to it. So you hear those creeping notes, higher and faster and faster and faster, accelerating in pitch and also in volume too, increasing. So we see a lot of musical elements already within this short example of the fire, Loge's fire leitmotif. Let's listen to this one. This is called Magic Sleep. So again, a very different sound than the first leitmotif that we heard. It's much more relaxed. It really does feel kind of like you're dozing off into sleep. And this last one is called Innocent Sleep. So remember that the magic sleep connected to the story is a little bit sinister. It's about Wotan causing Brunhild to fall asleep and lose her powers, essentially. This innocent sleep is meant to be a little bit more of a lullaby, a little bit more innocent. Let's listen to this innocent sleep leitmotif. So again, we can hear, I like what they said here, the rocking rhythms, lilting melody, and also stable harmonies. Everything seems like it gels or fits, harmonizes with itself a little bit better than we heard in the Loge's Fire, where things are a little bit more chaotic. We hear more chromaticism. We hear a variety of pitches, whereas this one is nice and simple, almost like a child's song, a lullaby. Let's continue here. Wagner used his large brass section to represent strength and power. Wotan's spear, which features the trombones and tubas, marches confidently down a scale into the very low range. Let's listen to this one, Wotan's spear. So imagine a spear where you're talking about a tool used for fighting, for wartime, so the music has to be able to signify that. I think that's a good fit. The next one, Siegfried's heroism, begins with a confident leap up to the tonic and often grows in volume. Many listeners observe that this leitmotif closely resembles John Williams' theme for the Force. So we're already seeing possibly a connection that maybe this leitmotif here was an inspiration for John Williams in creating the Force theme that we heard on the previous slides. So let's listen to this, the Siegfried's heroism leitmotif representing confidence and bravery. Beautiful. And again, we hear the French horn, the same instrument as before, that really does represent a hero for a lot of this music that we're talking about. And I do hear that connection to the Force theme from Star Wars a little bit too. And now the last one, Powerful Destiny, which is heard throughout this scene, consists of a simple but surprising shift from one harmony to another. Wagner weaves all of these leitmotifs together into a tapestry of orchestral and vocal sound. So this is the Powerful Destiny. We're going to hear dramatic and surprising shifts from different harmonies, different chords of music that give us very different emotional effects. Let's listen to this one. So not much there, obviously, but remember that this already has a completely different rhythm from the other ones that we heard. We heard a lot more long notes, right? This creates a sense of longing and connected to the idea of powerful destiny. This destiny that is shifting, that we can't always know what our destiny is. We cannot predict what events will unfold or what the future has in store for us. But we have this idea that destiny is a powerful force that is greater than us. So the music has to be equally as mysterious and a little bit vague, actually. Finally, this scene, which is often referred to as Wotan's farewell, exhibits one of the most significant powers of the leitmotif, its ability to foreshadow events yet to come. In the final moments of the scene, Wotan declares that only a hero who does not fear his spear will be able to pass through the flames and wake Brunhilde. He sings this declaration to the melody of Siegfried's heroism, which is then echoed by the full orchestra and a resounding climax. At this point in the story, however, Siegfried has not even been born yet. Sieglind has only just learned that she is pregnant with him, and he will not appear until the next opera. At the same time, the theme is not new. It has been in use since earlier in the opera to foreshadow the appearance of a human hero, and it will be heard 9 times in the next opera. When we hear this music, therefore, we know exactly who is going to wake Brunhilde, even though Wotan, who sings the melody, does not. This is a really key point here. The fact that we can hear a song that represents the hero of the story, Siegfried. In this case, Wotan, who is, for more or less purposes, the bad guy of this story, he is actually singing a song that is set to the same melody as Siegfried's heroism, the leitmotif that we heard earlier with the French horn. The fact that he's doing this a whole opera before Siegfried even is part of the story, before he is even born, this is a classic example of foreshadowing. We're using the music to foreshadow a character who has not been born yet. We've heard it already to talk about this legend of a human who will defy the gods and wake Brunhilde. before he is even born. So again, this is a huge power of the music, is that we can hear things through the music that the story itself does not explicitly say. The music is this way of delivering some information to us that really cuts deep to our understanding of the story. Now, this is a longer video. If you click on this YouTube link here, I would encourage you to listen to this from 7:53 all the way to 13:19, or really, 13:19 or so, maybe a little bit past this. But listen to this piece of music. Remember that it is in German, so you might not understand the lyrics that are happening. However, you can listen for these musical points. You'll also notice that at these second marks, you will hear these leitmotifs. A lot of them we've actually heard in the previous slides. But listen to how Wagner takes these themes and puts them in order with each other in a way that is smooth and connected and helps tell this larger story. We have conflicting characters and ideas, and they're represented through these leitmotifs. So again, pause this video, watch this video from Wagner's Ring Cycle of Wotan's Farewell, and follow along with this listening guide. Okay. Now, with Wagner, it is important to consider some things. First, I want you to look at this picture here. This is a postcard of the concert hall that Wagner designed for his operas, specifically for his works. So he clearly had a vision about the pieces that he wanted to compose. Now, let's continue reading here some other considerations and even some concerns about Wagner for not musical reasons, but for more personal reasons. There is no question that Wagner's Ring operas have been both influential and successful. They are staged in countless opera houses around the world every year, often at great expense. The most lavish cycle to date was produced at New York City's Metropolitan Opera House in 2012 at a cost of $19.6 million. So remember, that goes into the sets, the costume, the musicians, the lighting, everything that has to go into a big production like this. Every year, fans travel to the Bayreuth Festival in Germany to see the Ring Cycle and other Wagner operas staged in the theater that the composer himself designed. At the same time, some critics argue that we should no longer produce these operas or listen to Wagner's music. Their argument is not that the music is bad, but rather that the composer's ideology is so repugnant as to merit the erasure of his art. Wagner's anti-Semitic views were widely known during his lifetime. In an attempt entitled Jewishness in Music, 1850, he argued that Jewish composers were incapable of producing profound musical expression, and that their attempts to do so were damaging to the progress of art. Furthermore, he claimed that Jewish artists lacked the capacity to recognize or represent authentic German culture. Although Wagner first published the article under a pseudonym, presumably to make his attack against other composers seem less personal, however, in 1869 he republished it under his own name and with a long addendum reflecting the artistic and political developments of the intervening decades. Wagner's views provoked considerable resistance among his contemporaries, but they were later embraced by the Nazi Party. Indeed, Adolf Hitler would become Wagner's most infamous admirer. There are also concerns about the content of Wagner's musical dramas. While the Ring Cycle is not overtly anti-Semitic, it expresses an ideology of nationhood that tacitly excludes all but ethnically pure German of Wagner's imagination. Stripped of their mythology, the Ring operas tell the story of a human race that rises to a position of world dominance. For Wagner, this was the German race, and the German race did not include Jews. For these reasons, Wagner's music is unofficially banned in the nation of Israel, while music lovers around the world hold his work in disdain and choose not to program or consume it. The debate whether we can separate an artistic work from its creator, however, is far from settled. Should the sins of the artist be visited upon the art? Can we enjoy music, films, or paintings that we know to have been created by reprehensible individuals? Does it matter that Wagner died many years ago and can neither profit nor suffer as a result of consumption decisions? Does support of Wagner's art suggest support of his ideas? We are forced to grapple with these questions not only in the case of Wagner, but every time that the creator of beloved cultural products is discovered to have committed hateful actions. So, this is to say, at what point do we separate the art from the artists themselves? Is it possible to like the music or the artwork of an individual who you don't agree with in some way, or who does something very hurtful toward another group of people? In the case of Wagner, we know that these anti Semitic feelings are extremely negative and just awful. It's hard to imagine, um, these kinds of thoughts being in someone who created such um, exquisite music in some ways, but that's kind of what we're faced with, right? So, just some considerations to put into account. Gustav Holst. So we're moving on to another huge influence towards John Williams. So while John Williams' approach to creating the Star Wars soundtrack can be traced through Wagner, his music itself is more heavily influenced by other composers and works. The most frequently noted of these is the orchestral suite The Planets, written in 1914 and 1916 by British composer Gustav Holst, who lived from 1874 to 1934. The reasons for which Williams chose to borrow from Holst are simple enough to understand. Holst was one of the first composers to write music about outer space, and he did so with a dramatic flair that kept his work in the repertoire ever since its 1920 premiere. So we're going to talk now about a different composer, Gustav Holst. Holst studied composition at the Royal College of Music in London, where he met with moderate success. He was not attracted to the life of a professional musician. Holst played the trombone, but he struggled to make a living as a composer. In 1903, therefore, Holst began teaching music in schools. Although he would write some of his most successful music for the orchestras he directed, he had little time in which to pursue his craft. Nevertheless, Holst continued to produce serious concert pieces, and his reputation steadily grew. Holst finally earned national attention in 1920, first with a work for choir and orchestra entitled The Hymn of Jesus, and then with The Planets. The Hymn of Jesus paved the way for the Planets' success by establishing for Holst a reputation as a mystic and spiritual composer. As we will see, these qualities are prominent in his orchestral suite. Although the entire suite was not premiered until 1920, Holst had been at work on it since 1913. He first wrote the music for 2 pianos and produced the orchestral score only after the composition was complete. So what we're saying here is that Holst was exploring some realms of ideas that other people were not pursuing as much. He was writing a piece called The Hymn of Jesus, and then The Planets. So he builds this reputation as being a spiritual and kind of mystically looking composer. We can also say that is interesting is that this piece that we're going to listen to was originally written for just 2 pianos, but over time it was grown out to include a whole orchestra from those same piano parts. So he rewrote the piece for a whole new set of instruments, the symphony orchestra. Much of Holst's work as a composer can be traced to his personal interests. This is certainly true of The Planets. In 1913, Holst traveled to Majorca with a group of fellow artists who introduced him to the study of astrology. Holst became fascinated and immersed himself in the work of British astrologist Alan Leo, reading his book, What is a Horoscope and How is it Cast? The idea of composing an orchestral suite came to him almost immediately, and he began sketching the first movement, Mars, the same year. Holst's intent was to capture the astrological significance of each of the planets as described by Leo. He was interested in the specific characteristics bestowed on those who were born under the influence of each individual planet. At the same time, Holst was a composer first and an astrologer second. His primary concern was musical cohesion and expression. As a result, he frequently deviated from Leo's prescription and, in the end, used Leo's writings merely as an inspiration for his own creative work. Here we see an image of Alan Leo's astrological work, which inspired the Holst compositions. Looks like an early form of a horoscope. It seems that Holst was worried that audiences would not take his music seriously. An orchestral work inspired by celestial bodies, after all, might easily be dismissed as a mere novelty, especially when compared to the traditional symphonies that form the core of the concert hall repertoire. So he was worried that people would think that this is just a novelty. He's, writing something that isn't maybe serious. For this reason, Holst first titled his suite Seven Pieces for Orchestra, only later changing it to The Planet, so he gave it a different name almost to disguise it. He added the individual movement names indicating which planet the music is about, only just before the work was published. The descriptive titles qualify the planets as program music, a term used to identify an instrumental composition that tells a story or paints a picture. Holst chose not to order the movements in order of their distance from the Sun. Instead, he swapped Mercury and Mars. The reason for this decision is clear enough. The music that Holst composed to depict Mars makes a great opener for the work. So rather than putting Mercury as the first planet that we hear in this set of pieces for orchestra, he puts Mars first because it's a more exciting opener for this selection. The Planets was a massive success. It was immediately programmed by orchestras all over England and has since become one of the most familiar and most frequently performed pieces in the orchestral repertoire. All the same, Holst came to regret his biggest hit. He continued to develop and grow as a composer, and within just a few years, he considered the Planets to be outdated. Critics, on the other hand, were disappointed when Holst's new compositions did not sound like his original blockbuster, The Planets. Although Holst went to write many beloved works, he never matched the success of The Planets. So we're going to take a look and a listen to these pieces, just a couple of them. Again, there's one for each planet of the solar system, except there is no piece for Earth, and there's no set of music for Pluto, because I don't believe they had been discovered yet. So this is, I think, 7 of the planets in the solar system. We will examine the first and last movements of Holst's suite. The first one is Mars, the bringer of war, and last, Neptune the Mystic. Mars served as a model for John Williams' Imperial March in the Star Wars soundtrack, while Neptune seems to have had a general influence on Williams' musical portrayals of space. So I like this. Mars, we can think, is the bringer of war. We can see this picture of the ancient Roman god Mars, who was the god of war. It makes sense that this would be connected to the Imperial March by Darth Vader's main theme. We can also say that Neptune, this planet that is on the very outer part of the solar system, had an influence on John Williams' music that he used whenever they were in outer space in those films. In astrological terms, the planet Mars is associated with confidence, self-assertion, aggression, energy, strength, ambition, and impulsiveness. Leo described those born under the influence of Mars as fond of liberty, freedom, and independence, noting that they may be relied on for courage and are fond of adventure and progress, but are also headstrong and at times too forceful. In mythological terms, Mars is the ancient Roman god of war. Holst seems to have combined these influences in his music, which is overtly militaristic. The staccato rhythms, we talked about that phrase staccato meaning short and detached notes. The staccato rhythms heard at the beginning are the rhythms of a military march. At first, they are played by the entire string section using a special technique known as col legno. For this technique, players turn their bows upside down and bounce the wooden stick on the string rather than the hair of the violin or the cello bow. Later, the snare drum, which is an actual military instrument, plays the same rhythm, which is heard almost throughout the whole movement. There is something very strange about Holst's march, however. It is in quintuple meter, with 5 beats per measure. So remember, last class we talked about rhythmic meter, that we had duple, triple, and quadruple. These are very common meters. Quintuple is a little bit more of a rarity. We don't see it very often, and it sounds a little bit stranger to us. It would be very difficult to actually march to this music. Holst uses other strategies as well to communicate the character of Mars. The first melody we hear is low and ominous, consisting only of a rising gesture followed by a small descent. As the texture thickens, the volume increases and the melodic gestures seem more threatening. The introduction of trumpets and other brass instruments reinforces the militaristic flavor of the movement. In the middle section, the trumpets seem to be sounding battle calls. Finally, the whole movement comes to a crashing close, with the strings and brass playing as loudly and violently as possible. So again, remember what we learned about Mars on the previous slide, this idea of aggression that sometimes can go a little bit too far maybe. We also have the idea of military instruments. We talked about the snare drum, we talked about the bugles or the trumpets, these instruments that have always been used to signal battle cries of opposing armies. It makes sense that these are used for this piece, Mars. And it's always good to note this different texture of the strings. Using the bow upside down, striking with the wooden part of the bow is a very unique technique that gives us a more percussive, a more rhythmic sound from the string instruments, which are usually thought of as being very beautiful and calming. They're not that way in this piece at all. So like I say, pause this video. Instead, listen to this video of Mars from Gustav Holst's The Planets. This would be the first piece in the 7. Try to listen for these instruments, and also try to listen for the 5 beats per measure, what we call quintuple meter. Now the next planet, this is the very last one in the set actually that we'll talk about today, but the other 5 are excellent as well. If you want to listen to the whole thing, it's a great piece to listen to all the way through. Holst's representation of Neptune, the final planet in his suite, is entirely different from Mars. This is natural enough, given Holst's astrological mindset, for the influence of Neptune is associated with idealism, dreams, dissolution, artistry, empathy, illusion, and vagueness. Holst creates music, therefore, that captures these qualities. And remember that it's called Neptune the Mystic. So we're going back to Greek and Roman mythology here. We might begin with a discussion of timbre. Neptune includes a sound that is completely absent from the other movements, women's voices. So of all the 7 pieces, this is the only one that includes vocalists. Holst includes 2 choirs of sopranos and altos, making for 6 separate vocal parts. The women don't sing words, however, but are instead instructed to sustain long, open ah vowels. The singers therefore function in the same way as an instrument, bringing an ethereal, transparent quality to the upper register of the orchestra. So remember, when we say upper register, we're talking about the fact that these are the 2 female voices that we typically hear in a choir. The soprano, the highest, and the altos are just a little bit lower than the sopranos. Also, we have no lyrics for this, even though we have singers. The singers are almost acting like another part of the orchestra, just contributing the sound of the voice through an ah and the different pitches that they sing. The articulation in Neptune is completely unlike that heard in Mars. While Mars is characterized by abrupt, accented rhythms, the pitches in Neptune are sustained and connected. Interestingly, this is the only movement that Holst originally composed for organ instead of piano. He felt that the organ, which can sustain pitches indefinitely, was better able to capture his musical vision. While both Mars and Neptune are in quintuple meter, the differences in articulation and tempo, Neptune is much slower, means that the two movements have completely different effects on the listener. Finally, we might say something about the melody and harmony. There are no catchy tunes in Neptune. Instead, the wind instruments and voices repeat floaty, circular melodies that don't seem to go anywhere. Neptune is also not in any particular key, like major or minor, for example. Instead, the music rocks back and forth between seemingly unrelated harmonies. All of this creates the sensation of being unmoored or ungrounded. It is hard to predict where the music is going, but easy to enjoy the beautiful sounds. So again, this is almost like what we heard in the Destiny leitmotif of Wagner. It's meant to be a little bit more mysterious. We don't hear a true melody. Instead, we hear kind of this back and forth swaying of these different chords, these different pitches. They use the word airy, floaty, circular melodies that don't seem to go anywhere. And remember, this is about the planet that is on the farthest outskirts of the solar system and inspired the space scenes of Star Wars. So, go ahead and pause this video and listen to Neptune from the planets next. Okay, continuing here. So we've looked at two composers already. We've looked at Wagner and Holst. We're going to continue on with a third influence toward John Williams, and that is the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky. While the influence of Holst's Mars is particularly evident, after all, we hear the Imperial March repeatedly in almost all of the films, Williams was also tapped into the musical language of another prominent composer working at the time. This borrowing did not become one of the repeated themes in Williams' score, but is no less unmistakable. In addition, he borrowed for the same reason. Another composer of musical drama had already succeeded in setting the mood that Williams wanted to create. A mood reflecting uncertainty, suspense, and possible danger. Why reinvent the wheel? So we see here John Williams, and on the left, Igor Stravinsky. So Igor Stravinsky was a Russian composer, pianist, and conductor who later was of French and American citizenship at different times of his life. He is widely considered one of the most important and influential composers of the 20th century and a pivotal figure in what we call modernist music or modern classical music. So here's how Stravinsky maybe influenced John Williams. The scene in question comes early in the first film, A New Hope. The droids R2-D2 and C-3PO have landed on the desert planet Tatooine, where they argue and strike off in different directions. The setting is desolate and eerie, and the music serves to amplify our feeling of uncertainty about what is to come. We follow the path taken by C-3PO, who doesn't know where he is, where he is going, or what might happen to him. The music that accompanies this journey is similarly uncertain. Oscillating melodies in the winds and muted trumpets are paired with sustained notes in the strings and chromatic interjections from the bassoon and clarinet. Low, ominous sounds from the brass and reeds suggest a lurking danger. The music is neither in the major nor minor mode, and there is no sense of a home note, which we call the tonic. We are not provided with any conclusive musical gestures, like cadences, Instead, the pitches seem to float about. There is no sense of direction or purpose. At the end of this brief scene, the music simply fades away. At the end of this brief scene, the music simply fades away. In the context of Star Wars, we are talking about just over 50 seconds of music. Were it not for Williams' borrowing, this scene would hold little interest. However, the work from which Williams extracted this brief passage of music was among the most influential of the 20th century, and is therefore worth exploring in order to understand why Williams chose this source, why the original work was composed in the first place, and how the dramatic intent of the two composers can help us understand how music communicates meaning. So what we're saying here is that this scene of music, we use the word underscoring, that this is music that goes underneath a scene and helps to tell the story and elicit those emotions to the audience. So again, pause this video, watch this video from Star Wars, and see if you can listen to these oscillating melodies in the winds and muted trumpets. The idea that we're not really sure where the music is going or what direction we should go. It perfectly copies or mirrors the feelings that are happening amongst the two characters, R2-D2 and C-3PO. These are a couple of terms that you can start to think about in all of your writing, but they relate to what we just watched too. In music, we use the term tonality to describe the character of a piece of music as determined by the key in which it is played or the relationships between the notes of a scale or key. Tonality is an aspect of the pitch element of music. So this could be major or minor tonality are two of the big ones that we should know. Major tells us that something is happy or confident, and the minor to us sounds maybe serious or possibly sad. Cadences come at the end of musical phrases and can either reinforce or contrast the tonality of a piece. In the case of some of the program music we are hearing, the music is in neither the major or the minor mode. There is no sense of a home note, the tonic, and we are not provided with any conclusive musical gestures, cadences. Instead, the pitches seem to float about. There is no sense of direction or purpose. So the Star Wars video that we just watched is a great example of a piece of music that doesn't really have this sense of a home note. It doesn't have these cadences, so it doesn't really have a direction or purpose to it. It sounds a little bit more lofty to us. So let's focus on Stravinsky now. The passage adapted by Williams appears at the beginning of the second half of Igor Stravinsky's 1913 ballet, The Rite of Spring, which in French is Le Sacre du Printemps. Like Williams, Stravinsky needed music that would create an atmosphere of mystery and suspense. Both dramas are set in an undefined, distant past. Williams, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and Stravinsky's amongst the pagan tribes of prehistoric Russia. The differences arise when we examine the scenes for which each composer is preparing the viewer. C-3PO is about to be captured by traitors, while Stravinsky's characters are about to choose their victim for a virgin sacrifice. So again, this is music that directly influenced John Williams for his Star Wars music. Stravinsky wrote The Rite of Spring for a Paris audience for whom Russia was indeed far, far away. Although Stravinsky was himself Russian, he had been living in Paris and writing ballets for 3 years. He was recruited for the job by Sergei Diaghilev, a wealthy Russian who had embarked on the quest of exporting Russian ballet to Paris. To do so, Diaghilev established a ballet troupe known as the Ballet Russe. That's Russian ballet in French. His troupe specialized in flamboyant stage presentations that were meant to dazzle Parisian theatergoers with exotic stories, costumes, and music. When Stravinsky first agreed to join Diaghilev, he did so only because he had few other opportunities. He was unknown in Russia and had just begun his career in music. In accordance with Diaghilev's scheme, he participated in the production of a series of ballets with Russian themes. The first was The Firebird in 1910, which combined various Russian folk tales with a typically Russian musical language. The second was Petrushka, was set at a fair in the Russian countryside. The Rite of Spring carried on this trend to a degree, but it was also startlingly new in several ways. So here we see a picture that kind of shows some of the artwork that would have inspired these kinds of scenes that we're going to explore. More about Rite of Spring here. Like all ballets, the Rite of Spring was developed by an artistic team. The idea for the ballet was conceived jointly by Stravinsky and the painter Nikolai Roerich. Roerich, who was an expert on pre-Christian Slavic history, also designed the ballet's scenario, which is how the story unfolds, costumes, and sets. The choreographer, that is, the person who planned and taught the actual dance steps, was Vaslav Nijinsky, a famous dancer who had been part of the Ballet Russe since its founding and first performance in 1909. Working together, these three men put together a show that they knew would turn heads. At the same time, their ideas weren't entirely new. Artists working in Paris and beyond had for decades been preoccupied with so-called primitive cultures, which were believed to reveal fundamental truths about the human condition. At the same time, paintings of half-naked island dwellers, such as those proposed by Paul Gauguin in 1848 to 1903, were enticing and exotic. They allowed momentary escape from the constraints of Western society as they invited viewers to gaze upon supposedly innocent and uninhibited subjects. So we see some trends here. They're looking at early human cultures to try to find some artistic elements that they consider to be not primitive, partly primitive, but mostly innately human. They're trying to find what is the music that really connects us to our primal human instincts. What does that dance look like? What does the music sound like? And what story can we tell? It's also important to note this idea of the scenario, how the story unfolds. Because a ballet does not use words to tell the story, it uses music and dance, and I guess a little bit of acting through the dancers themselves too. We can't really tell a story in the same way. So the music, the dance, the costumes, the facial expressions are a huge part about telling the story in a ballet like this. Unlike most ballets, The Rite of Spring doesn't tell a particularly coherent story. It is in two parts. Over the course of part one, which is entitled Adoration of the Earth, members of Roerich and Stravinsky's imagined pagan tribe engage in a variety of rituals and games. In part two, called The Sacrifice, a young girl is selected as the sacrificial victim. She dances herself into death in the final minutes of the ballet. Obviously, that's acting. She doesn't actually die. But you can see here, what are they dealing with? Pagan tribes, this idea of adoration of the earth, games and rituals connected to pagan culture, and also this idea of the sacrifice, a much more serious tradition or practice that they might engage in as a ritual. The Rite of Spring caused something of a stir at its premiere, in what has been described as a riot, although historical evidence indicates that this characterization is overblown. Audience members reacted with consternation to what they saw and heard. To fully understand this response, we need to examine context, precedent, and the musical and visual elements of the ballet. So this really did kind of turn some heads. It would have been a very different kind of experience for the people that were used to seeing the ballet. To begin with, The Rite of Spring was not the evening's sole entertainment. It was the second ballet on a double bill. The first ballet that night was entitled The Sylphs, was a classic from the Russian ballet repertoire. Diaghilev had included it in the first Paris season of the Ballet Russe, so the audience knew exactly what to expect. And the Sylphs, which featured music by the 19th century composer Frédéric Chopin, was just the kind of thing Parisians wanted to see. The action consisted of elegantly clad dancers cavorting gracefully about the stage. Viewers admired the beauty and poise of the artists. The most disturbing element of the Rite of Spring, therefore, was not the plot or music, but the dancing. Nijinsky had abandoned the graceful gestures and acrobatic leaps of traditional ballet. Instead, he had the dancers stomping around on the stage on flat feet, with hunched backs and awkwardly protruding limbs. He did so in an attempt to capture the primitive and raw aesthetic of the subject matter, as he perceived it. Of course, all of this came out of Nijinsky's imagination. For him, the idea of ancient pagan tribes served as an inspiration to try something new and daring. He had no way of knowing how his subjects might have actually danced. So again, we don't know that pagan tribes danced a certain way, but we can guess they probably did not dance the same as a traditional ballet dancer would. So this opens Nijinsky's imagination as the choreographer to create new kinds of dance for the ballet stage that were more inspired by his interpretation of what ancient pagan tribes might have done for their dancing. So this is kind of a chart that shows some of the things that made this ballet, The Rite of Spring, so unique. So first is the dance and the choreography. Like we just talked about, I already read this passage. The choreographer, Nijinsky, had abandoned the traditional ballet steps and instead went for dancing that he thought was more probable of what pagan people would have done 1,000 years ago. The costume we can talk about too. Nijinsky's choreography was complemented by Rorik's costumes. Instead of delicate tutus revealing stocking-clad legs and point shoes, Rorik's dancers appeared in cumbersome, floor-length dresses and cloaks. The woman wore flat shoes and had long braids instead of neat buns. Audiences were thereby denied the opportunity of admiring the female form, a luxury that was central to the enjoyment of ballet. So again, we're changing the impression of what ballet has to be. It doesn't have to be dancers in tutus showing off the female form. Instead, we're dealing with more homely, more primitive dress wear that was meant to be, evocative of the pagan tradition. And last is the music. Nijinsky was also responding through his dance to Stravinsky's music, which was unlike anything that had been heard in the theater before. The music did not contain lyrical melodies or compelling harmonic progressions. It did not express feelings of yearning or heartbreak or passion, the typical human emotions of the stage. Instead, it was alternately mechanistic, mysterious, threatening, and frenzied. Stravinsky's ostinatos and pounding rhythms inspired Nijinsky's similarly repetitive and rhythmic choreography. So the music was very different from what we heard from Wagner, which was very romantic, very expressive in a certain sense. This is expressive in a completely other way. It's mechanical, it's threatening, it's frenzied. It has this very pounding rhythmic sense to it. This word right here, ostinatos, is a great word to use. Oops. It has to do with repeating rhythmic ideas that are pretty much constant through a piece of music. To understand how the music works, we will look at two examples, the introduction to part 2, later borrowed by Williams, and the sacrificial dance that concludes the ballet. The introduction opens with a dissonant cluster of notes. The oboes and horns hold their notes while the flutes and clarinets oscillate between pitches. What we hear does not suggest any particular key, major or minor. Stravinsky achieves this by having the instruments play in a number of different keys at the same time, a technique known as polytonality. This result is that the listener has no sense of direction or grounding. This disorienting effect serves to introduce a dramatic world with mysterious and unfamiliar characteristics. There is no discernible melody for a long time, just the ebb and flow of Stravinsky's unusual sound colors. When a recognizable tune finally appears in the violins, it is played using harmonics, a string technique that causes pitches to sound much higher than usual and gives them an eerie quality. The melody uses only 4 pitches, which we call quadratonic, and it was probably inspired by Russian folk music. So again, we see some similarities to what John Williams is doing with that scene with C-3PO and R2-D2. Things that are not really tied to any tonality, that are unfamiliar and disorienting in some ways. But we can also see the influence of Russian folk music in pagan tradition by using a very simple melody that only has 4 pitches. Okay, continuing with the introduction of part 2, Rite of Spring. Near the middle of the movement, the music changes. 2 trumpets introduce a new melodic idea, changing pitches in alternation with one another. Starting at this point, Stravinsky employs a compositional technique that is typical of the Rite of Spring. He begins to build up layers by bringing in the sections of the orchestra one by one, each with its own characteristic melodic motif. Motif is a fancy word in music for a musical idea. First, the strings begin to play quick rhythmic figures with repeated notes. Then, the clarinets and violins enter with upward melodic swoops. The musical texture slows, gets denser and busier, the swoops coming with gradually increasing frequency. This ends with the return of the quadratonic melody, 4 notes, in the horns as Stravinsky transitions into the next movement. The introduction has a pulse throughout, but the pulse is unevenly grouped into measures and phrases. For this reason, it is impossible to predict when a melodic or harmonic change is going to come. The effect is to leave the listener on edge, never certain what is going to happen next. Stravinsky uses this technique in every movement of the Rite of Spring, but to various ends. While uneven phrasing makes the introduction seem vague and mysterious, it makes the sacrificial dance, which concludes the ballet, sound violent and threatening. So we've talked a lot about the introduction of part 2. This is the video that goes along with that, so please give this piece a listen. You might have to go back to the previous couple slides when it comes to what to listen for, but the big idea is this unpredictable meter, the ever-changing accents and groupings of the notes that he puts into it, the quadratonic melody, and the fact that we're hearing instrumental groups enter one by one into this kind of cacophony or this frenzy of sound. Now we're going to go on to another part of the same piece, Rite of Spring. This is in part 2, but it's the very end of part 2 called Sacrificial Dance. The sacrificial dance is in rondo form, in which a primary melody returns throughout. It might be summarized as A, B, A prime, C, A double prime, C, A triple prime, with a brief coda, although in reality it is somewhat more complicated. However, using these letters will allow us to briefly discuss each section. So again, this is one of your homework questions. What is a rondo form? It's a musical form in which the melody returns throughout. So we can see here, we have an A melody, then we go to the B section of the song. The A melody comes back with just a small change. Again, we call it A prime. C, then another change to the A double prime, but the same basic idea. Then the C section again, and then A triple prime with maybe another small change, but still characteristic of the A section. Let's read about these. The A section is the most rhythmically jarring. The strings and wind play accented, dissonant chords in alternation with one another, culminating each time in one of two melodic figures: a short series of descending pitches or a series of repeated pitches with one higher outlier. Both figures are loud, accented, and aggressive, and due to the rhythmic irregularity, it is impossible to predict when they will be heard. So this comes as some sudden surprises here in the A section. The B section is significantly more subdued, although no more predictable. The strings provide an underpinning of irregular chords, while brass instruments periodically interject with accented, descending melodic fragments. The music builds in intensity before reverting to its original character. It then builds once more before the return of the A material, which we labeled A to indicate the fact that the music is just slightly different, A prime. So we heard A, we heard some contrast with the B section, we go back to A as A prime, and now we would hear the C section of the piece. The C section features a wide variety of percussion instruments, including timpani and cymbals. Over these, various brass instruments enter with heavily accented melodies. Again, the music gets louder and more intense as it builds into yet another return of the A material. A double prime, however, is very brief, for it is almost immediately interrupted by the continuation of C, now with even greater intensity. And then the final return of the opening material as A triple prime sounds significantly different, for it employs different sets of pitches. However, the rhythmic character is the same. Once again, Stravinsky builds the intensity of the music by alternating between his melodic ideas with increasing frequency, never establishing a pattern that will allow the listener to get comfortable. Finally, an ascending glissando in the flute, followed by a loud final chord, indicates that the dancing girl has collapsed. So, a lot of material here. A couple musical words to key into is glissando. This is a gradual raising of the pitch. It's a way that a flute player or any instrument can slide between a low note, usually, up to a high note. Back to the homework question, the rondo form. In this case, the homework question was asking you, why is the rondo form effective? When you look at this form, the fact that the A section keeps coming back, I would say this builds in some continuity within the piece. That even though we're hearing things that are very jarring, very rhythmic, very unpredictable, the fact that we hear the same unpredictable idea coming back and back and back and back with the A section, that gives a through line, some continuity to the composition that otherwise might sound maybe too random for a listener. So this is just one way of using the rondo form, but the idea stays the same. Whenever we see a rondo, we see a main primary melody that keeps coming back throughout the piece. Rondo, I always think of the word round. It's coming back, just like a wheel cycles back through on itself. Here's just more thoughts about the rondo form. This word coda, so after we hear A, B, A, C, A, C, A, we would come to a coda. Coda is a musical word for an ending. And again, notice how the A section returns throughout. That's what makes this a rondo form. Now, this is a real treat to watch. This is a video of Rite of Spring. In this case, they have actually tried their best to recreate the original choreography that would have been done at the premiere of the piece. So obviously, when this piece was originally written, there were no cameras, so we can only go based off of the choreographer's notes, but this is a pretty good recreation of the original dance steps that would have been in Rite of Spring. Again, this is the listening map that goes along with sacrificial dance that we just talked about, the rondo form. So I would, again, pause this video, watch this video instead, and follow along with this listening guide, it does a really good job of telling you at what second marking are we hearing these key moments of the piece. And here's some things to listen for. Okay, we're coming to close to the end of the chapter, you guys. So we're going to finish with one more example of John Williams borrowing or being inspired by music from different time periods, different cultures, and different styles. So we will consider one more of Williams' borrowings. This time, however, we will be giving primary consideration to style, for Williams was influenced by a pair of musical traditions, specifically those of ragtime and Dixieland jazz, rather than by a specific composer or composition. Before we can examine the borrowing, however, we need to take a step back and consider the different ways in which music works in film. So we will be getting to ragtime and Dixieland jazz, but we have to take one side tangent here to talk about the different ways that film composers use music within a film. So the big idea here is underscoring versus source music. Think back to the scene we watched before with C-3PO that was borrowed from The Rite of Spring. Was C-3PO able to hear the music that was in that scene? Did the eerie, discordant sounds tell him anything about what lay in store? Most viewers would agree that he heard nothing other than the wind across the desert sands. The music was only for us, the movie watchers, not for the characters in the scene. Indeed, most of the music in Star Wars seems to be only for the viewer, us. Darth Vader does not keep an orchestra on hand to play his entrances, and Yoda certainly doesn't have one out in the swamp. When we hear music while watching the movie, we understand that its purpose is to amplify emotion and help tell the story. It is not actually a part of the story. Okay, so this is to say that a lot of the music that we hear in movies and TV, the characters themselves are not aware of the music that's happening. It's only for us, the viewers of the movie, to hear. But that isn't always the case. Let's talk about it though. In the film industry, the technique is known as underscoring. It has been used since the silent era when theater organists and orchestras used to provide live music to accompany moving pictures that did not have dedicated soundtracks. Of course, this kind of music played a role in the theatrical presentations long before movies came on the scene. Operas and ballets, for example, also include music that the characters on stage cannot hear, but that is nonetheless essential to the storytelling. In general terms, this is termed non-diegetic music. Now, if there is non-diegetic music, this means music that the characters cannot hear within the play or the opera, or the ballet, or the movie. We call that non-diegetic. I always like to say that this is music that cannot be heard by the characters, non-diegetic. Now, if there is non-diegetic music, there must also be diegetic music. Music that the characters in the drama can, in fact, hear. In film, this is called source music, because the source of the sound is usually visible on the screen. Almost every film and television show combines these two types of music, diegetic and non-diegetic music. When a character is listening to the radio, or playing the guitar, or attending a concert, or dancing in a club, you are hearing source/diegetic music. When you can't see where the music is coming from and have good reason to doubt that it is audible to the on-screen characters, for example, when you hear an orchestra while watching someone walk down the street alone, you are hearing underscoring or non-diegetic music. Often, it is not obvious whether the music we are hearing is diegetic or non-diegetic. In the case of the Imperial March, for example, back to Star Wars, it is reasonable to believe that the Imperial Army might in fact have a band present that might in fact play a march. That's not impossible in the Star Wars universe, right? Many militaries have such musical ensembles, and even though we never see a band in Star Wars, we cannot prove that one is not present. At the same time, we can doubt that such a band would contain the full range of winds and strings that we hear in the soundtrack. Perhaps the Imperial forces are indeed hearing music, just not the same music that we are hearing. The opposite can also occur. In one famous scene from Alfred Hitchcock's 1956 film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, a live concert performance also serves to underscore the unfolding drama, such that we cannot confidently label the music as either diegetic or non-diegetic. It tends to be both in this particular case. These problems become much more frequent and difficult to solve in musical theater genres, as we will see later. Now, both diegetic and non-diegetic music can be equally important to the storytelling, although each type tends to serve a different purpose. The most striking use of diegetic music, music that they can hear, in Star Wars occurs 45 minutes into the first film, when the protagonist arrives at a bar to meet with Han Solo. In this scene, known popularly as the Cantina scene, we both hear and see a band playing a catchy tune. Because we see the performers, we can be quite certain that the on-screen characters are also able to hear the music as well. At the same time, the music makes sense in this context. It is natural for a bar scene to contain a band playing lively music in a popular style. So if you've seen Star Wars, or even if you haven't, the famous scene that we're talking about features aliens that kind of look like this. They're playing in the bar, in the cantina, and they're playing these funny looking instruments that are obviously, fictional, made up. But we are hearing music that is catchy, and we'll take a listen to it in a second. The style itself speaks to us. Although Williams is not borrowing from a specific composition in this case, he was borrowing from a rich tradition of African American dance music. Specifically, he is reinterpreting the rhythms and textures of two related dance music styles from the early 20th century, ragtime and Dixieland jazz. This is a good example of Williams borrowing from a popular style to make something that is clearly recognizable to us as a popular, jazzy music that we would expect to hear in a bar. And if you don't know this already, or even if you do, listen to this Cantina band song right here from Star Wars. You can tell it definitely influences from ragtime music and Dixieland. We'll take a look at both of these styles in a second, but first, listen to this Cantina band recording. Now, let's talk a little bit about ragtime. We all know the word jazz, but this is maybe a less familiar genre to a lot of people. Ragtime was developed in the 1890s by African American piano players working in Midwestern entertainment venues. These highly skilled musicians began to take a new approach to performing well-known tunes. A ragtime pianist would keep a steady beat with his left hand, alternating between high and low pitches, while performing complex syncopated rhythms with the right hand. A syncopated rhythm includes accented notes that do not line up with the underlying pulse, but instead seem to fight against it. While any melody can be ragged, that is, performed in this manner, African American pianists soon began composing and publishing original pieces with ragtime in the title or description. The style quickly caught on across the nation. Its syncopated rhythms were fresh and exciting, and they made the listener want to dance. By 1910, ragtime rhythms and references were common in all types of popular music. At the same time, white Americans exhibited a great deal of concern about the influence of ragtime, which was associated with establishments where alcohol was served and the opposite sexes mingled freely. It was believed that the music's enticing rhythms were so powerful that they might lead young people to commit immoral acts. Most importantly, ragtime was the first in a long line of African American styles to have a major impact on popular mainstream music. and it was therefore perceived as a threat by white cultural power brokers. So, to put this into context, you have a homework question that asks about what are syncopated rhythms. We also want you to define what is ragtime music. The other thing to think about here with this bottom paragraph is to think how often have we heard this even in the modern era? The idea that modern music like hip hop, rap, rock and roll, whenever there's new music styles that come across, the older generation is always going to be fighting against it because they're worried it's going to have a bad effect on the younger people. If you have ever gotten into a fight with a friend or maybe a family member who's older than you, that the music that you listen to isn't good music or that there's something wrong with it, it's not that different from the sentiments that were being felt here. So, this is a classic example of one of the most famous ragtime pieces ever called Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin. You can pause this video and check out this one in a second. When listening to the ragtime piano examples, notice the accompaniment pattern heard in the left hand of the piano. This type of playing is called stride piano and alternates between a low bass note and a chord, creating a duple or quadruple rhythmic meter. Let's talk about ragtime music, and we'll take a closer look to how form can be present in this style of music. We will take a closer look at the Black and White Rag from 1908, a composition by the Iowa pianist George Botsford. From 1874 to 1949 he lived. Like all rags, this piece is in a form derived from that of a 19th century marches. This approach to organizing music is based on the repetition of several distinct melodies, each of which is heard twice upon being introduced and then may or may not return later in the piece. So the idea here is that we're going to hear every melody 2 times at least, probably. The form of Black and White Rag can be summarized as follows. Intro, then A, B, B, A, C, C, B. As you can see, the melody returns after the introduction of B. The B melody then returns, in a modified form, after we hear C. The result is a musical work that balances repetition with contrast. The listener is able to identify familiar melodies as they return, but is kept from becoming bored by the regular introduction of new melodies. So again, we talked about repetition and contrast last week for week 2. You can see here that we do have some contrast between the sections, but ideas that do return and gives us that continuity. Like all rags, this piece is in a form derived from the 19th century marches. This approach to organizing music is based on the repetition of several distinct melodies, each of which is heard twice upon being introduced and then may or may not return later in the piece. Ragtime piano compositions were never intended to be performed exactly as written. A published composition in this genre should be understood as a set of guidelines for performance. The composer supplies the basic material, but the performer is invited to reorganize and elaborate upon that material. The recording selected for this text was made in 1951 by the Trinidadian pianist Winifred Atwell, who lived from 1914 to 1983. It proved a hit, selling millions of copies in the UK and launching a craze for Atwell's style of ragtime piano playing. Atwell preferred the sound of an authentic honky-tonk piano, as heard in this recording. This is not a specific type of instrument, but rather a general aesthetic that is associated with the sound of early 20th century barroom pianos. Such instruments were generally cheap, damaged, and out of tune. The piano in this recording has a tinny quality, while multiple strings that are struck each time the player depresses a key are not in tune with one another. More about Black and White Rag here. Atwell takes a typically improvisatory approach to her performance of Botsford's composition. So remember, a big question here that we're asking is the role of the performer versus the composer. Two different roles. In this case, Botsford was the one who originally wrote the black and white rag. He's called the composer. But we also have Atwell, who is a gifted piano player and also an improviser. So she's going to have her own take on this composition. This wouldn't always be possible in other styles of music, like a string quartet, classical music, for example, where the performers play exactly what is written on the sheet of music. In this case, there is an element of improvisation that can occur from the performer. Let's continue. She plays his introduction and A section essentially as written, although she does not repeat the A after the first time through. So already a small difference. Then she plays the B section, followed by a repeat of the A section. Atwell omits Botsford's C section, however, and instead interpolates her own material, so she's adding her own ideas to the mix. The new music, which includes several contrasting phrases and transitional passages, fits well within the performance but bears no relation to what Botsford wrote. To conclude, she plays the B and A sections once more, adding a final tag of her own creation. Atwell's performance, therefore, can be diagrammed as follows with her original contributions in brackets. Intro, A, B, A, then into Atwell's ideas, a transition, D, E, and F sections, another intro, then back to the B and A from Botsford, followed by an outro that came from Atwell. In sum, therefore, this is a performance of a piece composed half by Botsford and half by Atwell. The syncopated, danceable rhythms of ragtime are easy to hear in Williams' barroom music for Star Wars. The texture of ragtime, regular pulses in the low range, lively melody in the high range, is also evident. The instrumentation, however, echoes that of another African American dance music tradition, one that burst into the scene just as ragtime was becoming passé, Dixieland jazz. So we get a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but notice just all the different notes that they talked about here between the two creators. Botsford, who originally wrote the piece, and Atwell, who is really just the performer, but adds her own improvisational ideas to this recording. Again, pause this video, listen to this performance from Winifred Atwell performing Black and White Rag. It should follow this form right here. It's a short little piece, only 2 minutes and 24 seconds or so. Okay, so now we're going to be moving into Dixieland Jazz. The style that would come to be known as Dixieland Jazz developed in New Orleans in the early years of the 20th century. The previous slide said, too, that this came after ragtime music was kind of starting to lose its popularity. Like ragtime, Dixieland Jazz was heavily influenced by marching band music. Street bands provided an important form of entertainment in the city, and formal ensembles regularly processed between the various neighborhoods. Less disciplined musicians, known as second-line players or a second-line band, would tag along behind the bands, improvising syncopated melodies on top of those being played by the ensemble. So the idea here of the second-line band is that you had your marching band already, but behind the marching band would be more amateur musicians, perhaps, or maybe people who weren't in the marching band, who would play along with them, but in more of an improvisational style. They're making up their own musical lines that would fit on top of the marching band's music in this case. This was very popular in New Orleans jazz, early jazz. This practice resulted in a new performance style, and small groups of musicians began gathering together to play syncopated music on traditional band instruments. Usually clarinet, trumpet, trombone, and tuba with banjo, which provided the rhythmic underpinning. Dixieland jazz is also sometimes referred to as polyphonic jazz, due to the fact that all of the musicians play independent melodies at the same time. The term polyphonic means many sounds, and is used to describe music in which all parts carry melodies of equal importance. This is one of the textures that we talked about in the previous week's slides too. Now, let's talk about a very important figure in jazz history, especially Dixieland jazz. This is King Oliver. One of the first great Dixieland band leaders was the cornet player Joseph Nathan King Oliver, who lived from 1881 to 1938. You can see here the cornet is another word for a trumpet-like instrument, so we can see it right here. Despite having established a formidable reputation in New Orleans, King Oliver moved to Chicago in 1918, hoping to secure a better life for himself and his family. He was not alone. Millions of other African Americans living in the post-bellum South made the same trip in what is now termed the Great Migration. In Chicago, King Oliver was able to recruit the finest players for his band. These included a young Louis Armstrong, who had also learned his craft growing up in New Orleans. Oliver played first cornet, while Armstrong played second cornet and slide trumpet. The other musicians in Oliver's band were clarinetist Johnny Dodds, Honoré Dutry on trombone, Lil Hardin, later became Lil Armstrong, on piano, Bill Johnson on banjo and the string bass, which came in place of the tuba, and Baby Dodds on the drums. King Oliver and his Creole jazz band quickly gained popularity, and the recordings that they began to release in 1923 sparked a national craze for jazz. So you can see here, this is a more modern take on the Dixieland Jazz Band that still performs today this kind of music. We see here a clarinet, a trumpet, a saxophone, a trombone. This is a stand-up tuba, which is called a sousaphone, and also a drummer right here. So more of a modern take on the Dixieland Jazz Band. One of King Oliver's most influential compositions was Dippermouth Blues, which his group recorded twice in 1923 for two different record labels. We're going to examine the first recording, made in April for Gannett Records. The way this recording was made had a significant impact on how it sounds. Before the electric microphone was invented in 1925, music was recorded using acoustic technology. The musicians would gather around a horn that looked much like those you would see on old gramophones. Those who played quiet instruments would stand close to the horn, while those who played loud instruments would stand further away, sometimes behind a barrier. The sound waves then entered the horn, would cause a stylus to vibrate, which would in turn carve a groove into a rotating wax cylinder. The limitations of this technology meant that certain sounds could not be recorded. In particular, instruments and voices that were very high, very low, or very loud caused the stylus to skip and ruined the recording. This explains why we don't hear string bass or very much percussion in this recording of Dippermouth Blues. A live performance would have been slightly different. So you can see here a great picture of recording during this time period, what it might have looked like. You can see here, this is the acoustic cone, essentially, that would the musicians would perform into. The sound travels through this cylinder, through this cone, onto a rotating cylinder that would actually be able to record the material onto a wax cylinder. It's a very old way of recording. It even predates how we record records there. And you can see too, we have instruments like the violin that are a little bit softer in the front here. And we see, I think, a drummer way in the back here, a cello way up here, a trombone way in the back. So the lower and louder instruments were generally put further away so that they wouldn't cause damage to the wax cylinder as much as possible. Now let's talk about Dippermouth Blues. After a brief introduction, we hear an excellent example of the Dixieland style as both cornets, the clarinet, and the trombone all play unique melodies at the same time. It is impossible to say who has the melody, for the music being played by each instrument seems to be of equal importance. The various instruments also take turns emerging from the texture. At one moment, the clarinet seems to stand out, while at another, your attention is drawn to the trombone. After a while, the clarinet really does take the melody, while the other instruments play a repeated rhythm in the background. Later, the cornet similarly takes a lead role. Near the end of the recording, we once again hear the polyphonic texture that marks this style. This music is busy and complex, but in a way that is also simple. Its object, after all, is to make you want to dance. If you feel compelled to tap your foot or otherwise respond to its syncopated rhythms, then the players have accomplished their goal. The title of this selection also provides us with valuable information. Dippermouth was simply a nickname for Louis Armstrong, a fact that has led some to believe that Armstrong wrote this tune, not Oliver. We can't be sure. The term blues, however, describes several important characteristics of the music we are about to hear. So again, we're going to talk about the blues in a second. This is a good example. This piece, Dippermouth Blues, it has blues right in the title. We should know what that is, but this really is Dixieland jazz, but also with some blues elements as well. So you can listen to this now and follow along with this listening guide right here. Oops. So, finishing up here with the blues. Little bit of information. The blues was an influential style of African American popular music that emerged on the vaudeville stage and later flourished among musicians of the Mississippi Delta region. There is much to say about the blues style, but here we will focus on two elements that found their way into Oliver's composition. The first has to do with harmonies. Upon listening to Dippermouth Blues, you might notice that you hear the same chord pattern over and over again. This pattern repeats every 48 beats. Listen to the percussion. Or, if we group those beats into measures, every 12 measures. What you are hearing is called the 12-bar blues, and it provides the structure for most blues compositions. This is a very popular form, the 12-bar blues. Nearly all blues are in 12-bar repeating forms. There are every once in a while a 16-bar blues, but the 12-bar blues is, I would say, the most popular for sure. Continuing, this is a great map of the Mississippi Delta region. Part of what made this music so important is that it actually was able to travel up and down the Mississippi River, was a major commerce point. People use this for traveling, for goods, for exchanging culture. So if you could ride this Mississippi River up, you were able to share what you had with more and more people. Remember, this is pre-internet, before social media, so sharing music and culture had a very different role. The other element from the blues that we hear in this example is the blue note. All of the harmonies used in the 12-bar blues chord progression are in the major mode. It sounds confident or happy. And the melodies, therefore, ought to be in the major mode as well. In the blues tradition, however, performers sometimes lower certain melodic notes, an act known as bluing the note. These are usually the 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees of the scale, although other notes can also be blued. Because of this, the melody occasionally clashes with the harmony, as the music pulls alternately toward the major and minor modes. This gives the music a particularly expressive dimension and encourages the listener to get physically involved. Whether or not you can identify the blue notes in this recording, you certainly feel their impact. And again, this is talking about Dippermouth Blues on the previous slide. Maybe you can hear those notes that kind of have a little bit of a sour sound to them. We call them blue notes, and they give us a tiny bit of tension within the blues. Now, when we examine John Williams' use of ragtime and Dixieland styles in Star Wars, we see how music intended for a purely practical purpose, in this case dancing, can be used to tell a story. Ragtime and Dixieland jazz are not storytelling genres, but their sounds communicate many layers of information to the modern listener. They suggest dancing, nightclubs, drinking, and excitement. They might also suggest the story of African American contributions to American popular music, or the historical eras from which these styles emerged. In this way, we might consider all music, not just film scores or theatrical works, to have storytelling potential. So, what they're really saying here is that this scene from Star Wars that features these aliens playing these odd looking instruments, they're playing music that really is similar to Ragtime in Dixieland. That was a choice. They could have gone into this cantina and heard rock and roll music, right? John Williams could have chose to write aliens playing rock music, but instead he decided to go for Dixieland, jazz, and ragtime. He's trying to bring our memory to a place of dancing, nightclubs, drinking, and excitement in kind of an old time saloon style, maybe. Remember, it's at a cantina. So, this is an artistic choice that he made, and the music really does help contribute to this part of the story. And those are the ends of the slides. So, again, you can listen to the Cantina Band one more time if you'd like to, but that is all the information that I have for you this week. So, I hope that you enjoyed the lecture. It's a lot of information this week, so go through the slides on your own to answer those questions, and I hope that you enjoy checking out all the music and were able to learn something new this week. Have a great week, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks. Bye.